In case you missed it, because you're a normal person out there living your life and you don't have time to riot in the streets, protesters with Black Lives Matter over the weekend projected a massive rainbow onto the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond, Virginia, in support of LGBTQ elemental rights. Because, as we all know, Lee was a Confederate general who led an infamous crusade against gays. Welcome to 2020, folks, where everything is made up and the facts don't matter. So after spending weeks watching looters and arsons burglarize and torch random stores while Antifa hippies take over entire city blocks in Seattle, if you're still wondering whether the mass protests that have rocked cities across the nation for the past 3 weeks were really about protecting Black lives, here's another tidbit to add to the massive and growing pile of evidence that they're actually about a much larger radical left-wing agenda. Activists over the weekend projected a rainbow representing gay pride onto a massive statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. It's the largest of several monuments to Confederate leaders that stand on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, and its 40-foot granite pedestal had already been severely defaced with spray paint and signs reading, among other things, Black Lives Matter, Stop White Supremacy, and as always, F the police. Because nothing says treat us with respect quite like scrawling profanity all over your own city streets. Now, vandalizing and destroying public property is not okay, but let's say, just for the sake of argument, that one could kinda understand when a movement that calls for racial equality targets a statue to a Confederate general. While it does not justify defacing a historical landmark, there's at least a linear connection between an anti-racism movement and a statue to a man who helped lead a war effort that was, in large part, to support the continued legalized slavery of blacks. It was what it was. And you might be able to make that association if that were what these protests were actually about. But you know, given that Robert E. Lee didn't lead a charge against gay rights, this doesn't track at all. Of course, these are the same morons who spray-painted a statue of Gandhi in D.C. and defaced a monument to Matthias Baldwin, one of the country's earliest abolitionists. Sorry, that's a big word. That means he didn't like slavery. But the fact that he was one of the first to argue for black voting rights a full 3 decades before the Civil War didn't stop ignorant vandals from spray-painting the word colonizer on his statue. Now, lest you assume that these incidents were just one-off occurrences by a few stupid apples, think again. Black Lives Matter managed to blur the boundaries of their own movement with yet another rash of protests this weekend, this time in support of black trans rights, a protest for the societal inclusion and protection of black Americans who've decided to identify as a gender other than the one they were born with. Thousands showed up in support of this effort, which has absolutely nothing to do with George Floyd or police brutality. But who cares when a movement becomes an all-out war to fight the power, even if you can't intelligently articulate who the power is or what exactly you're fighting for. And therein lies the problem with the Black Lives Matter movement, and with pretty much any movement ever led by the left. It is not about black lives. Never has been. It's all a front for Marxism and their radical push to reshape America. It's not about weeding out bad cops, it's about abolishing the police and installing chaos where anyone can do anything with no consequences. Don't believe me? Here you go, straight from the New York Times. And isn't that just the way of it, over and over and over again? What starts out as a cry for justice inevitably devolves into some bizarre pro-trans, anti-capitalism, go-green riot, where looting and arson are acceptable responses to injustice, and any unemployed 20-something with a cardboard sign is a hero. It's a crusade that somehow simultaneously demands big government solutions and total anarchy, where hippies take over entire city blocks in Seattle to set up their own autonomous city-state, and then demand that other people outside of it give them food and clothing for it. It's so intellectually inconsistent that it boggles the mind. If this movement were a piece of art, it'd be a kindergartner's finger painting. A blind cat walking across a keyboard could write a more coherent strategy than this. If you actually think that abolishing the police is a serious proposal, you are dumber than a sack of bananas and clearly not interested in finding actual solutions to any of these problems. If you think spray painting a city and turning it into a third world shantytown is suddenly a viable community just because you planted some basil in the middle of it, you shouldn't be trusted to lead a dog on a leash, let alone a national movement. If you think projecting a gay pride flag onto a statue to a Confederate general makes any sense at all, please, for the love of all that is holy, go pick up a history book. They make them for elementary school students. Maybe start there. And if you think that any of this, at any point, has had the tiniest bit to do with George Floyd, I've got some oceanfront property in Arkansas you might be interested in, because that is more believable than the claim that this has anything to do with justice. And that's your Reality Check America. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube page, like us on Facebook and Twitter, and stay sane out there.